Good evening. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Fahraaz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. Now, as the genocide continues in Gaza and the death toll going beyond the 51,000 mark since October 2023, 2 weeks ago, Islamic resistance movement Hamas and its Al-Qassam brigades filed a court case against the UK government, requesting it to remove itself as a terrorist organization. It was back in 2021 when the then Home Secretary Priti Patel of the United Kingdom had listed not just the Al-Qassam brigades as a terrorist organization, but also Hamas and its political bureau as a terror organization. The case is currently in the UK courts, and we're going to be diagnosing each other with two of my guests in this panel discussion. So joining me from London, the United Kingdom, I'd like to welcome Fahad Ansari, who is a lawyer at Riverway Law based in the UK, and with me in studio, he's no stranger to Hilaal TV, from Media Review Network, and an expert in Middle Eastern politics, especially when it comes to Hamas. I'd like to welcome Dr Firoz Osman. I'm going to be touching with Dr Osman in a bit, but I'm going to start off with you, Fahad. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah so much for joining us here on Talking Point on Hilaal TV.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Thank you for giving me the space to talk about what we're doing.
No, it's an absolute pleasure, Fahad. Fahad, let's start off, of course, in 2021, November that year. You've got, of course, then Home Secretary Priti Patel announcing that not just the Al-Qassam Brigade, but also Hamas as a whole, including its political bureau, declared a terrorist organization. We're now in 2025. Talk to us about the journey for this case to be brought against or brought to the government of the United Kingdom. I beg your pardon.
So if you just want to take things back a bit further, the Al-Qassam Brigades was prescribed or banned in the UK in 2001, over 20 years ago. And for the next 2 decades, the British government used to treat Hamas, the political bureau, as a separate entity, one that they could have dialogue with, one that they could negotiate with, one that maybe they didn't like their politics, but they were still an actor, a main protagonist in the ongoing conflict. Until even 6 months before Priti Patel decided to prescribe them, the British government was actually saying that we're looking forward to working with a unity Fatah Hamas government. They were saying in Parliament that they recognize the specific distinction between the political and military wings. And then all of a sudden, Priti Patel, who was a politically compromised figure, remember, she is the politician who in a previous life was the International Development Secretary and was sacked by the then Prime Minister Theresa May because she was secretly meeting with Benjamin Netanyahu and other senior Israeli officials. So this woman is completely compromised. She is brought back in from the cold by Boris Johnson when he becomes Prime Minister and given the position of Secretary of State for the Home Department, and that's the position critically that deals with national security. Priti Patel was under serious lobbying from the Israeli government. She probably didn't need the lobbying. She's ideologically aligned with the Israeli government and with the Zionist politics. And she then comes in and, unknown to many why she did this, nothing had happened. There'd be no 7th of October type operation. There'd be no major escalation. But she suddenly decided to prescribe the political wing on the basis that there's an artificial distinction between the political and military wings, and that because it increases anti-Semitism in the UK, apparently Hamas in its entirety needs to be prescribed. What's interesting after that is that this almost a period where no one knows how to deal with this. People are afraid in the community in the UK, can we meet with Hamas anymore? Because what prescription does, it's almost like you had your banning orders in South Africa. You can no longer wear an emblem of the organization. You can't have meetings with more than 3 people in which a member of the organization is present. You can't invite support for the organization. You can't express support for it. So all of these matters mean that Hamas is very, very rapidly isolated, marginalized from any discussion about Palestine in the UK, which is ludicrous because it is the civil administration, the de facto civil administration, Gaza. It is the organization that won the last free and fair elections in Palestine. And you cannot have any discussion in Palestine without involving Hamas. It's just ludicrous. Well, the true implications of the ban really came to be seen in the last 18 months, because the same language of prescription was a language of dehumanization, and that's the language of genocide. Because suddenly every hospital, every journalist, every school, every civil building could be targeted on the basis that this is linked to Hamas. And that is the language of genocide. That is the action of genocide. And we believe that one of the main motivating factors where we're pushing for deprescription is that we have a situation where military can fight, but leave the politics out, leave the politicians, and leave anything related to the political wing out of this. Because without that, we're just going to carry on plunging into the darkness.
I'm going to bring in Dr. Osman. Dr. Osman, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Always a pleasure to have you on. Dr. Osman, talking to what Fahad is saying, they won that elections 2005. From then onwards, one could already see that Hamas's backs were against the wall, because immediately then the West had slapped sanctions. It's a 20-year-old history, and it's something that, even though Hamas won something which is free and fair, it was difficult for them to really operate in a way which they could provide so many aspects to the people of Gaza.
Well, yes, the election took place in 2006. I think they came into government in 2007. And it was a shock to the Western world, in particularly to the United States of America and Israel and the Europeans. I mean, even President Carter attended that conference, that election, and he regarded it and declared it free and fair. The Arab world is not known very well for its free and fair elections, so that came as a pretty bad shock. I must say that Hamas didn't expect to win it either, but they won it quite handsomely. So that was a shock to the Western world by itself, including Hamas. They didn't expect and were not prepared to take it over. Hence, they wanted a government of national unity with Fatah, with the PLO and so on, so that they could move forward. But not surprisingly, Israel and the United States of America put a lot of pressure on the PLO, on the PA as such, to renege the agreements between Hamas and Fatah at that stage. So, you know, it is something that we need to understand about Hamas, that it is, as it was mentioned, a civil administration. It has a long history of dealing with the Palestinian population and uplifting them. So they were popular. And unfortunately, even for the Western world today, they remain very popular organization even today.
Fahad, I want to take this quote from Daniel Gritters. He's one of the lawyers leading the legal proceedings. Of course, you would know him quite well. In an interview with the Andalou agency, he said that Patel's decision, and you mentioned it quite well, was made for political reasons and constituted an abuse of power. One would look at this and say, when this case is presented, that kind of puts it in good light for Hamas, that when this case is being presented, that there's something that can be seen in a positive light for them. I say this, and I ask this question to you, because as you mentioned, she is compromised. The fact that she had met with many Israeli lobby groups, including Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, could that be something that could work in favor for the legal team of Hamas when this case is presented?
Well, the way the application works is that the government will first look at this. It hasn't gone to court yet. The first stage is to present the application to the executive, to the government, to make a decision on it. And they're going to be looking at it in light of what the current situation is in April 2025. They're not going to so much be looking at what happened in the past, although we do mention this because our position is, and our client's position is, that the British government has always maintained a distinction between the political and military wings of any organization involved in conflict, like it did in the north of Ireland with the Sinn Féin and IRA. The IRA was prescribed and banned, but Sinn Féin was not. That allowed it to have those back channel negotiations that ultimately led to the Good Friday Agreement and peace in that country for the past 3, 4 decades. That's not happening anymore. And so we want to present it as this figure was politically compromised. She did go against the grain of what the British state has had as its practice and its policy, and not just in Palestine, but around the world. And if we do, and we are intent on seeing a just and secure settlement to what's happening, you have to involve all parties. You have to speak with people you don't like, and you might not like their politics, you might not like their ideology, but you, as all conflicts resolve, you have to sit down with them. And that's simply what I was saying. And what I'm seeing now, to be honest, even yesterday in the Parliament, they had the Foreign Affairs Select Committee hearing into the Israel-Palestine conflict, and a barrister with the UK Lawyers for Israel, one of the major Israeli legal lobby groups in this country, Natasha Hostorf, she was giving evidence, and she was coming out with some appalling, preposterous claims that they have had meetings with the British and American governments, who have both at all times said that they are satisfied that Israel is not acting in breach of international humanitarian law. And Emily Thornberry, who heads up that particular Foreign Affairs Committee, and she was a former shadow attorney general under Keir Starmer while he was in opposition. And she cut her off very quickly and said, "Be careful what you say." You could see she was very angry with her. And Emily Thornberry is somebody who was supporting Keir Starmer's position of starving the population in Gaza. And it just seems that the tide is turning, that people have had enough of Zionist propaganda. People are seeing it for what it is. Even those who traditionally were supportive of Israel, I think they've sort of just had enough of this. They realize the end game is nothing to do with hostages. It's nothing to do with Hamas. It's all to do with Zionism. It's all to do with taking all of the land between the river and the sea for Israel and to ethnically cleanse the land completely of Palestinians.
After the break, I continue my conversation with this panel discussion with Dr. Firoz Osman and Fahad Ansari. Do stay tuned. We'll be back with Talking Point. Welcome back to Talking Point, Dr. Osman. I want to come to you. You were mentioning something in the break, and I think it's important to touch on it, bring the IRA, the Sinn Féin, but on the fact that when, of course, the 1967 war had finished, Israel had seized Gaza and, of course, had put this brutal occupation and brutal rules to that. And we're currently seeing it still at this moment, close to it being 60 years. The fact that when you are under occupation, Dr. Osman, you have the right to resist. And you've mentioned it quite well in your book. And, of course, the Hasbara, the Israeli propaganda, has particularly had that set where it says that Hamas is a terrorist organization. They've started all of this. But clearly, under international law, it's right over there. And it's something I'm going to be asking Fahad in a bit. But talk to us about that and obviously how it relates to IRA, Sinn Féin, and right here at home when, of course, the battle against the National Party had occurred.
Correct. I think Brother Fahad mentioned IRA, but we in South Africa had the same problem.
Sure.
And I recall one of the doyen of our journalists, Alistair Sparks, when he went to Damascus to meet Musa Abu Marzouk, and it is Dr. Musa Abu Marzouk that is laying this charge by the British government now. And he interviewed Dr. Musa in Damascus. And he says it was redolent of him when he went, and that time the ANC was a proscribed organization.
Yes.
We could not even mention the name of Mandela. You could not fly the symbols. Same thing as what is happening in London today, that, this any symbol or any relation to Hamas is proscribed and you can be charged as a criminal act. It was the same in South Africa at that time. So, people like Nelson Mandela, Oliver Tambo, Alfred Nzo, Kathrada, they were not to be mentioned. Their photographs were not, you couldn't even see their photographs. So when Alistair Sparks went and he tried to meet, and he did meet the ANC in Lusaka, and he met with Thabo Mbeki, in London subsequently, trying to understand and develop a relations with them to see what are they made up of. And he found them, very safe. They were not bloodhounds as it is made out to be today as Hamas. And, when he met with Musa Abu Marzouk in Damascus, he wanted to meet Khalid Mishal, and he was shocked, by the way, of Musa Abu Marzouk. I mean, Musa Abu Marzouk was, he had a PhD in engineering in the United States of America, spoke soft-spoken, very eloquent, and he said very clearly that all we want, and this is echoed by what Hania wants, it is the question of land and men.
Yes.
And this is what we want. We want our land. From the river to the sea, Palestine must be for us, and of course for men. All those that have been exiled and have been kicked out must come back to their land, to their villages, and to the land in Palestine. So it is a question about land and men, nothing to do about violence against Jews or anybody else. And Musa Abu Marzouk made it very clear that it is nothing to do with Jews, it is nothing to do with Americans or Europeans, that they have no vendetta against them. It is anybody that is occupying our state, and that is what we're after. And Alistair Sparks brought this back to the South African media very clearly to say that there is an organization that is speaking in this way, even talking about a hudna, a truce with the Zionists. And if that is the case, how do you develop a peaceful dialogue or reach a resolution if you do not speak to these people? The same thing as he said that we needed to speak to the African National Congress. So it resonates very clearly with us that Hamas as an organization in the UK needs to be unbanned in order for there to be a dialogue and a resolution to the conflict in that area.
Fahad, interesting, and again, what Dr. Osman points to, dialogue. Right now, there can't be dialogue. There's mediations that are happening with, of course, Qatari and Egyptian officials. But I want to touch on occupation, and this is mentioned quite clearly by Gruters in his interview, and of course, something that, along with yourselves as the lawyers taking this case, have pointed out. When there is occupation, there is a necessity for armed resistance. That is going to be important, is it, in the presentation of this case? The fact that the portrayal of Hamas as this terrorist organization right now seems to be quite far-fetched. The fact that they are an armed resistance group against an occupying force. Talk to us about that and how this could help with regards to this case.
Thank you, Fahraaz. So the first thing is to mention is that Israel, contrary to popular opinion, does not have a right to self-defense. It is the occupier. It is in belligerent occupation. So it's already on the offense. So it does not have the right to self-defense. The people who do have that right are the occupied peoples of Palestine. Now, how Palestinian resistance manifests itself has changed over the ages. Sometimes it's looked like the PLO, sometimes it's like Fatah, sometimes it's looked like Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The current manifestation is Hamas. That is representative, by all expert accounts, Hamas is the most potent and most effective military resistance in Palestine right now, which is defending the Palestinian people against extermination. So what we say then is Britain has obligations under international law. It has an obligation to take all steps to prevent acts of genocide. The acts of genocide are being carried out by Israel. So Britain has an obligation, it's not a voluntary option for it, it's an obligation to take all acts to prevent acts of genocide. It's an obligation under the ICJ ruling to take all steps to end Israeli occupation of the occupied Palestinian territory. It's an obligation under Britain under the ICJ ruling to give effect to Palestinian self-determination and to remove all obstacles to self-determination. And as we are aware, under international law, self-determination includes the right to armed resistance to secure that right of self-governance. Now, we are arguing in this application that the prescription, the ban on Hamas, is impeding all of those issues I just mentioned. And because of that, the ban is contrary to Britain's obligations under international law, because what it effectively does is it denies Palestinians the right to resistance, the right to self-defense, the right to protect themselves against extermination. I was having a discussion with another colleague recently after we launched this application, and he brought to memory the arms embargo that was imposed on Bosnia 30 years ago. And as we know, this summer is going to be the 30th anniversary of the Srebrenica genocide. And he said the prescription is, in effect, having the same consequence for the Palestinians trying to defend themselves. The arms embargo said you can't arm these Bosnians who are defending themselves against genocide. The prescription says you can't even express support for the Palestinians who are defending themselves against genocide. So in fact, it goes further. Arms, at least in Bosnia, you could express support for the resistance. Here, you can't even do that. So at all levels, the way you look at it, Britain is sorely in breach of its obligations and duties under international law.
Dr. Osman, with all that said, what Fahad is saying, the fact that under international law, Britain has a right not only to recognize Hamas as a resistance movement to fight against the occupied power, but also their right to exist to protect its people. You don't see that happening at this moment, because it's quite clear Britain, from what we see, seems to portray to the world that it has this obligation, and we talk of the word obligation, towards Israel from, of course, the time of the Balfour Declaration. How is that played out? Because it's quite clear that the alliance that the United Kingdom, Britain has with Israel is something that is there for the past 100 years since that Balfour Declaration.
Very true. I think this is why I view some of these cases with a great deal of cynicism. We in South Africa are very proud of our ministers, of our government, and the former foreign minister, our international relations, Naledi Pandor, mentioned again last night that it was the entire government that lodged this case at the ICJ. And it is taken a great deal of courage, because it's historic, and it is against the very people that are actually complicit and supporting without any shame these Zionists that are, committing this, in my opinion, genocide. Although the ICJ has called it plausible genocide, and now
but it's quite close to it actually being it. Yes.
It is,
yes,
and she mentioned again last night that we have a virtual watertight case against Israel, and they've asked for an extension, and hence my cynicism, because they were granted another 6 months extension to respond. Meantime, the genocide is being continued. I mean, it is horrific what is going on. It is the first time that we have seen such horrific pictures live streamed 24/7 on our screens. So, I believe that countries such as the United States of America, Britain, France, Germany, and others are actually concerned that if this case goes on and Israel may be found guilty, they'll be charged of being complicit in supporting Israel in committing this acts of genocide. So I believe, yes, there is a definite in international law, I think Chapter 7, Article 51 of the United Nations Charter, where they have the right to resist, and they are doing that. And it is incumbent upon all of us to join South Africa in supporting the resistance movement.
After the break, we continue this conversation. Are we going to be touching on the current ICJ cases, the ICC arrest warrants, and how much that would play into the hands, or not the hands, of Hamas in terms of this case? Do stay tuned. Welcome back to Talking Point. Fahad, I want to come to you. So currently at the ICJ, of course, we've seen two rulings that were given, of course, challenged by Israel. The first, of course, occurred last year towards the end of January, where there was the ruling of plausible genocide that is currently occurring in Gaza. When you read the actual rule books of the Genocide Convention, it's quite clear that Israel is committing it. The fact that they are blocking aid coming in, starvation is occurring, and the fact that the amount of bombs that are being dropped constitutes that. And then, of course, there was one ruling that happened in July last year where the ICJ had ordered Israel, and I'm using the word ordered because it's right there in black and white in pen, that they need to remove itself from the occupied territories. What they are doing constitutes apartheid. With those two rulings, including the ICC arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant, how much does this play into the hands of this case being in favor of Hamas and its legal team, including yourself, for there to be quite a plausible presentation for this to occur?
It's definitely helpful because it's not a Palestinian advocacy group calling them out for genocide or saying that Netanyahu should be arrested, he's a war criminal. It's no more, we've gone beyond sloganeering. It's now become, official. These are the international institutions that have been set up in the wake of World War II and the Holocaust to try and ensure that such crimes did not escape accountability in the future. And these very institutions are now indicting the Western colonial project in more ways than one. And that will have to be taken into consideration by the Secretary of State when she's considering whether to deprescribe Hamas. Because whether they accept it or not, Zionism is in terminal crisis. And as you highlighted, the Prime Minister of the country is an international fugitive of the law. It's not possible for him to land in most Western countries of his allies without there being an obligation on the authorities there to arrest him. Meanwhile, Israel is sending back members of parliament of the governments of other countries like France and the United Kingdom because they don't like their politics. I mean, these are allied nations, and they're sending, one prime minister can't land in the soil of the other. And then at the same time, the members of parliament prevented entry into Israel. Israel is on trial for genocide. It's been found to be an apartheid state by the International Court of Justice. Apartheid is a crime against humanity. There's no going back from this anymore. I mean, Israel is finished. Zionism only has a few more years on the clock. And we are saying to the Secretary of State in this country that you need to actually consider the day after. Not the day after the genocide, the day after the collapse of Israel. Who are you going to be speaking with? How can you isolate Hamas from that conversation? They have to be invited to the table. And I think Britain needs to get to grips with this, with the changing reality on the ground. In previous cases where organizations have come off the banned list, that has occurred precisely because of a change in the political dynamics on the ground. And what we are saying is all of this points towards a huge shift. Like it's not an inconsequential shift. It is an enormous shift in the politics on the ground that our government has to be attuned with.
Dr. Osman, what is interesting what Fahad is mentioning, it's the day after. But prior to that, you've heard the lobby groups, whether it's BDS or the different organizations in South Africa, you look at it overseas, the word, of course, apartheid was being thrown, but from a legal perspective, it was not ruled. The ICJ have ruled it. They've ruled that Israel is now an apartheid state and that they need to remove itself from the occupied lands, Gaza and the West Bank. In January, when I had you here, Dr. Osman, and I remember this conversation when we were sitting together and the judges had made that ruling at the ICJ. You said the clock is ticking for Israel in terms of it obeying international law. Unfortunately, we are now 16 months in. The genocide has gotten worse. They've broken a ceasefire agreement. It doesn't look good on them right now, doesn't it? Because the more they break the law, the more international condemnation goes against them.
This is, an absolute violation of international law, and they do it with impunity. And that's why this case in Britain is so important for us, because it is going to be landmark in many ways. I recall many years ago, when ZP Livni was coming here, she was, I think, foreign minister at that time, and including Shimon Peres was going to visit South Africa. We at the MRN lodged a case charging them for crimes against humanity, and she didn't come. She ran away. There were others that were army spokesmen, Israelis, that were in the country. And unfortunately for us at the moment, the National Prosecuting Authority in South Africa seems to be lagging in our case, where we have about 75 South African Jews who have fought in Gaza.
Yes,
And the case is there for the last 10 years. And we're trying to pressurize them that what is causing the delay in prosecuting these people. So the legal case in UK is important, as it is here. We need to use all possible instruments. And I concur completely that Zionism is in its death row. It is seen from internally, and of course the October 7th attack has shown its absolute vulnerability. I can go through a list of what has happened in Israel. We see the deaths, we see how the immense suffering of the Palestinians is there, but Zionism is crumbling. And what is important for us, and there's going to be a march against the Egyptians, is that the paralysis of the Arab world as well. You know, it'll be interesting to know if this case goes through, besides speaking to the legitimate representatives of Palestine, who are the other countries going to speak to? They have to speak to Hamas and Islamic Jihad in this case. So we look forward to this case. I think it will shore up our case as well.
Yes.
And, you know, Zionism is no doubt in a crisis. Their propaganda, their hasbara has failed, as has been mentioned by Brother Fahad at the moment. People are getting fed up. And people are seeing through the hasbara, the lies that have been perpetrated. The absolute dehumanization of the Palestinians is a language that the world doesn't believe anymore.
Impunity is an interesting word that Dr. Osman has used, and it's quite clear that even though the ICJ rulings have occurred, Israel has maintained its brutality on the Gaza Strip. And Fahad, I think that's going to be interesting in this case also, because the fact that the more Israel continues this genocide, the more it looks in favor of Hamas, because Hamas can then continue to say, well, they're continually bombing Gaza. And under international law, the fact that you can be an armed resistance against an occupying power, it just gives more credence to this, doesn't it?
Well, it does. I mean, impunity went out a long time ago. Israel doesn't even use excuses anymore that it was a Hamas hospital or a Hamas tent or a Hamas bathroom. They don't use even that language anymore. We are months beyond them caring what international law or the international community felt about them. It seems that with the arrival and inauguration of Donald Trump, things intensified. But let's remember, the end game has always been this. From 77 years ago, with the founding of Israel, this has always been the end game. This is what Lemistique coined, an attorney in New York. She coined it an incremental genocide, and that's I would echo that sentiment. And this is just the intensification period of that genocide, but it's been going on for 77 years. What's happening now is that normally when any ideology, any nation is at its end, it will go through an enormous streak of violence of the most like gut-wrenching barbarity, as we are witnessing on our screens every day now. It's going to be very, very painful. But at the end of this, that ideology is finished. It's like it's just getting the most it can out of it, but ultimately nobody will be able to live with this state after this is finished. It will lose all relationships, it will lose all credibility. And Hamas, on the other hand, whatever you might say happened or did not happen on the 7th of October, and our client has given a very detailed witness statement about the events of that day from its perspective. The last 18 months has shown Hamas engaged only in military conflict against the Israeli military, the Israeli soldiers, military objectives. And that stands in stark contrast to the IDF and the Israeli politicians with their rhetoric, their genocidal language of dehumanization, which implements itself in attacks on civilians on a daily basis. So one thing that I've noticed in the United Kingdom in the last 18 months is the general mass support, and I use that word very cautiously, for the Palestinian resistance in general, and particularly for Hamas, has risen to extraordinary levels. And even Israeli cheerleaders like Douglas Murray, he's written a whole book about this, that he cannot understand why so many people in Britain support Hamas. But it is because they are seeing on the screens what they observe to be a very disciplined, militarily effective resistance movement fighting against and fighting for their people against a brutal, genocidal nuclear power. And if you have given ordinary people a choice between the two, people will always support the resistance over the empire. I mean, it's Star Wars 101.
Yes, definitely. Well, after the break, we wrap up the conversation with Dr. Firoz Osman and Fahad Ansari. We'll be back after this break. Welcome back to Talking Point. We're in the final segment of this panel discussion with regards to Hamas bringing a case to the United Kingdom to have itself unbanned as a organization or as a terror organization. Fahad, in the instance of this case being successful for you, your team, for Hamas, what message would it send to the rest of the world in terms of them now being seen as a resistance organization? I ask this because this is the United Kingdom. It's a member of the United Nations Security Council. It's one of the largest powers in the world. The fact that if this case were to be won, the United Kingdom as a nation would have to recognize Hamas not as a terrorist organization, but as a resistance movement. Talk to us about the significance of this should this case be won.
Well, the first thing to note is that, as you're well aware, the UK position on Hamas is an anomaly. The vast majority of countries in the world do not view Hamas as a terrorist group. They do not ban Hamas. In fact, Hamas has many missions and offices in lots of these countries. And it's seen as a resistance movement. When you get out of the Western-centric bubble, most people in the world, as in ordinary public, they're supportive of Hamas, or at least neutral. It's only in Britain, America, the Five Eyes, New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and Europe, which is a very small portion of the world, albeit powerful. It's a very small percentage of the world that Hamas is banned. But since we launched this application, we have been contacted by dozens of lawyers in different jurisdictions in Australia, in New Zealand, in Germany, in Ireland, recently in Belgium, who contacted us and asked us for advice and help in bringing their own applications to delist Hamas. So already, whether we are successful or not, the ripple effect is happening. People are realizing that we don't need to live with this status quo. There is an option to try to delist and to look for a future where Hamas is not isolated, but is actually part of the system. And I think the more applications like this are made, the more the conversation develops. And the climate, I mean, remember, Fahraaz, these are political decisions. They're not legal decisions, they're political decisions. The decision to prescribe or deprescribe is a political decision. And it takes a very courageous Home Office or Home Secretary to make a decision to deprescribe a group that is on the banned list. And what makes it easier for them is if the conversation is already happening in the general public, that this group should not be deprescribed, should not be banned or prescribed. So what I'm hopeful of is that even whether we win or lose, that the climate will be there for a future Home Secretary in this country and other governments around the world where Hamas is banned to have the courage to take them off that list.
Dr. Osman, interesting, as Fahad is mentioning, when you look at the global south, the recognition of Hamas as a resistance movement is quite large. The fact that they know that in order to end Israel's brutal occupation, a necessity of armed resistance is needed, and international law states that. But if this case is successful for its lawyers and Hamas, this just allows there to be more recognition of what they are actually fighting for. That's going to be huge, isn't it?
It is. I think, South Africa, one can understand its support for Hamas because we were the victims of the settler colonialism.
Ireland could be mentioned the same also.
Ireland is exactly the same, and as are many of the global South countries. As Fahad mentioned, that it is a minority, probably 10% of the world, that's the European, white European American world, that proscribed Hamas. But the rest of the world is in support simply because they recognize, and we have been victims of the very same colonial entities that ruled us for so many years. This is a just cause. Hamas is fighting a just cause. It is a moral cause. It is a righteous cause. And the world is beginning to recognize it. Yes, we have the right to resist. And, we can see the, as I mentioned, impunity of how they are continuing to massacre and brutalize Palestinians. So it is a crumbling edifice. And I think if anything, the Zionists must realize that the end is nigh. And I think the world, it will be good for Britain, France, whatever we can do in order to save not only the Palestinians from this genocide, but even the Jews who are living in Israel as well. That their time has come, and I think they are crumbling into the desert sand, and the sooner they end this mindless massacre, this brutality, it will be better for the rest of the world.
Fahad, we've got about 2 minutes. Just to get your closing arguments to this panel discussion.
I think, thank you for the time, for allowing me to express my opinion here. We don't get that in Britain very often. We need to keep talking about Hamas. We need to keep talking about the application and the reasons why it should not be on a banned list. The vast majority of the public, I feel, are supportive of the application, but they need the courage to be able to express their opinion, because right now that's been criminalized in this country. Kneecap, the Irish rock band, recently, they have come under criticism and called for their prosecution because they said they supported Hamas, allegedly. Whereas artists all over the world can say, we support the apartheid in Israel, we support Israeli war crimes and genocide, without any fear of sanction. That is an appalling scenario.
Yeah. Dr. Osman, this is going to be massive in any way possible, whatever the outcome is. But whatever does happen, the world is shifting. Look at the United States of America right now. They're having difficulties within their own country. Europe slowly moving to the right. The global south, especially with this trade war occurring, you've got China, who's now becoming such a massive player within the trade war. Do you believe the shift in global politics is going to take a further step should this decision go in favor of Hamas?
We need to continue the pressure. I don't think we can take our foot off the pedal. It was mentioned last night again by the International Relations Minister that we need to be continuously active. There is no doubt that there is going to be a shift. There is a shift in the opinion. We need to ram up the legal cases as well as the boycott, the BDS and so on. Israel is in dire trouble. Zionism is known to be a settler, colonial, racist, apartheid entity that is not allowed to be within the family of civilized nations any longer.
Fahad, absolute pleasure having you on. Shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That's Fahad Ansari, who's a lawyer at Riverway Law based in the United Kingdom. Dr. Firoz, always a pleasure to have you on. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Shukran wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi.
That's Dr. Firoz Osman from Media Review Network. And as the genocide continues in Gaza, the perception around the world is going to change, whatever the outcome of this case is. But what needs to be mentioned, what needs to be analyzed is that when you look at the law, when you look at the ICJ rulings, it's quite clear there is an illegal occupation that is happening within the areas of the West Bank and Gaza. And under international law, armed resistance is necessary to go ahead and combat the occupation. This is why this case is going to be interesting, because recognition from the West, even though the global South has a massive recognition for armed resistance, it was the same case in South Africa with the Umkhonto we Sizwe and the ANC as a political party, that when its unbanning occurred, the change there reverberated around the world. We're going to see something very similar as global politics continues to change. The United States of America is going through difficult times when it comes to the trade tariffs, the clamping down of many dissenting voices within the US. Does now the West still have leverage across the entire world, or is the global South going to seize its opportunity at this time, in this day and age, to become a superpower and a change the world truly needs? This has been Talking Point from myself, Fahraaz Patel, and the rest of the team in Johannesburg. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.